Introducing the Elevenlabs Text-to-Speech API. The Elevenlabs Text-to-Speech model is an AI speech synthesis model that can translate text into a realistic and natural-sounding voice. This technology has many use cases in accessibility, education, language translation, gaming, and more.
Leon, this sounds good and all, but how can I use this API in my own application?
I'm so glad you asked. In this video, I will show you how you can use the Elevenlabs API to add text-to-speech to your own application. We will fetch a list of available voices from Elevenlabs and then generate audio from a web page.
Welcome to my Elevenlabs API tutorial.
Although this example seems simple, you will learn how to create a reusable API for interacting with the Elevenlabs API in your very own application. As for the prerequisites, this tutorial is beginner-friendly, and you only need a very basic understanding of JavaScript to follow along. You also need Node installed. Go to nodejs.org and install the LTS version of Node. You will also need a code editor, and in this tutorial I'll be using VS Code. Because we need both a front-end and server-side code, I'll be using a framework called Next.js. Knowledge of React and Next.js is beneficial, but is completely optional in order to follow along. So, let's begin. Create a new folder for your project and then open up the command line. I'll use the integrated terminal in VS Code. We can now set up our Next.js application by executing npx create-next-app at latest. Because I want to install the project in this directory, I'll just enter period and then enter. For TypeScript, I'll say no. For ESLint, I'll say no. For Tailwind CSS, I'll select yes. For source directory, I'll say no. And for the experimental app directory, I'll choose yes. For aliases, I'll just press enter. This will now install the dependencies for our Next.js project. Let's clean up the project files as well. First, in the app directory, we will be creating our own backend API for communicating with Elevenlabs. So I'll rename this sample hello folder to something like Elevenlabs. We can ignore the route file for now, but we will come back to it a bit later on in the API section of this tutorial. For building our front end, we will make changes to the page.js file. In this page file, we can remove all of these imports, including the font. We can also remove everything in this return statement. So from the opening main tag to the closing main tag, I will simply replace this with a main tag with some text, hello world, and I'll save this. We can now ensure that our Next.js project is working by starting the development server. We can do this by running the command npm run dev. This will now start our development server at localhost 3000. We should now see our application loading. Let's clean up the folder structure a bit more. Let's remove some of these styles from the global CSS file. I'll delete everything except these 3 lines. Let's save this. We can now start building the front end of our application. Feel free to jump to the API section of this video if that's all you're interested in. The first thing I'd like to change is the font used in our project. We can change the font by opening up the layout.js file. Then at the top of the file, we can import Poppins from the next package, fonts, and then Google. We then need to create a variable for our font. So I will call it Poppins. I will set that equals to Poppins. This takes an object as its input. So first we need to specify the weights as an array. So I will import the following weights for our project. Then we need to specify the subsets as an array, and I'll select Latin only. We can then add this font to the body tag by adding class names. We will set that equal to an object, and we will pass in Poppins.class name. After saving this, you should see the font changing in the application. I would also like to change the background color and add some other styles to our application. So in the globals.css file, we will add some base styling to the application. So I will write @layer base. We will then specify the body tag, and we'll apply our Tailwind style sheets by typing @apply. We'll add a background of blue 300. We will give the body a height of 100 viewport height, and we will align the contents of the body with flex. item center, and justify center. This will move all of the contents in our body page to the center of the page. We can now close the globals style sheet and then go back to our page file. Let's remove the hello world text. We will then add a new div, which will serve as a wrapper for our application. Let's give this div some styles by adding class name. I'll give it a background of white, vertical padding of 4, horizontal padding of 4, rounded of medium. Then within this div, I'll add a new h3 tag with the text say something. We'll give our h3 a few styles like text 2x, a font of bold, text blue of 800. We'll convert the text to uppercase with a margin bottom of 6. Below the h3 tag, we'll add the input fields for our form. So I'll create a new wrapping div. I'll give this div a few styles like margin top and bottom of 6. I'll align the contents with flex and flex column for vertical alignment and the gap of 4 between the items. I'll add another div that will contain the drop-down list for the voices and the label text for the drop-down. First, we'll add a label for the drop-down with the text select a voice. Then below the label, we'll add a select element. We'll just give it one example option for now. So we'll add an option element with the text Bella. Let's give the select a few styles by adding class name. We'll give it a background blue of 100, padding top and bottom of 2, padding left and right of 4, and we'll round the edges with rounded large. Let's give the div that wraps these two elements a few styles as well. So on this div, we'll add class name. We'll align everything with flex with a gap of 4. And we'll align the items center. That's created some spacing between these two elements. Then below this wrapping div, we'll add a text area, which is a self-closing element. Let's give this a few styles, like padding 4 all around. We'll give it a border, and a border blue of 100. We'll round the corners as well with rounded large. We'll disable the outline with outline none. Let's also change the placeholder text with placeholder gray 400. And when we focus on the box, I want a little drop shadow to appear. So I will add a focus within state. So this will trigger whenever the user focuses on the box. And for this, we will add drop shadow of medium. So you will notice when I click into this box, a little drop shadow appears. Let's also give the text area some placeholder text. So I will add a property called placeholder, and here you can add any text. Next, I do want to make this input box a bit bigger, so I'll also add properties for columns, which will make 50. For rows, we'll make it 10. And after saving that, this looks a lot better. Then, in order to have access to the value in the dropdown and the value in the text box field, we'll create references to these fields using the useRef hook that comes with React. So at the top of the file, we will import useRef from React. Note that when we save this, we will get an error message. That is because components in Next.js are server-rendered components by default. So if we need to give the user the ability to interact with the page, we first need to convert this component to a client component. This is real easy. All we have to do is at the top of the page, in quotes, we'll add use client. After saving this, you shouldn't get any error messages. Then within the home component, we'll create new variables. First, we'll create a variable called voiceRef. We will set that equal to useRef. Then we'll create another variable called textRef, which we will set equal to useRef. We can now create these references by going to the select element and adding a property called ref, which we will set equal to voiceRef. Then on the text area, we'll also add a ref property and set that equal to textRef. We can now use these references to get the values of these fields. Then below the text area, we'll create a button. We'll give it some text like generate text to speech. We'll give this button a few styles. So in class name, we'll add padding top and bottom of 2, padding left and right of 4, a background blue of 800. We'll make the text white. We'll round the borders with rounded large, and we'll add a hover state. So when the user hovers over the button, we'll simply set the opacity to 80%. After saving this, we can see the button, and when we hover over the button, the opacity changes slightly. We also need to create an on-click event handler for the button. So when we click the button, we want to call a function called handle generate text-to-speech. Let's go ahead and create this function. So just above the return statement, I'll just add a comment, and then let's create our function. We'll call it handle text-to-speech. It doesn't take any parameters as input. And what this function will do is, first it will get the value of the selected voice, and it will get the value of the text that we've entered. It will then call an API, which we'll create in this Elevenlabs folder a bit later on, and it will pass the value of the voice and this text to the API, and the API will return back to us the name of the audio file that was generated. But we'll get back to that a bit later on. So for now, when we click the button, let's simply get the values of these fields and write them to the console. So I'll create a variable called selected voice, which will set equal to voiceref.current.value. We'll create another variable called text, which will set equal to textref.current.value. Let's write these to the console. So I'll write selected voice to the console as well as text. Let's save this. Let's enter some text in this box. Let's open up the console, so you can go to your developer tools, open up the console, and let's click on generate text-to-speech. And we can see our two values pulling through. Now that we have our user interface completed, let's work on the back-end logic. In order to make use of the Elevenlabs API, you need to create an account on Elevenlabs and sign up for one of the packages. Elevenlabs offers a very good free package, which grants you 10,000 characters per month. And for only $5 a month, you can use this model for commercial use, and you get up to 30,000 characters. And what's very cool is you get access to instant voice cloning, which means you can train a model on your own voice. And this is something I'll cover in a future video. But for now, simply select the free package and create your account. After logging in, you should see a dashboard like this. Basically, at this point, you can test out the different models and try out the different sounds. So under settings, you can select from a range of voices, and you can click this little play button to sample the voices.
If you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always gotten.
You also have access to some other settings that you can play with to get some interesting results. But in our demo, we'll pretty much mimic this interface, where we will pull through a list of voices, these voices here, with this text box. And after clicking on generate, we'll get the audio back as an audio file, which we'll store on our local node server. But what we need from here is the developer API key. To get this, click on your profile, then open up profile, and on this pop-up, you can see the API key. Simply click on this little button to view the key and then copy the key. After copying this key, you're welcome to close this browser window. So, back in our project, we will store this key in an environment variable file. In the root of the directory, create a new file and call it .env.local. We will then create a variable name. So I'll call it Elevenlabs API key. And I'll set that equal to the key that I just copied. After doing this, you can save the environment variable file. In order for the project to see this new variable, we have to restart our development server. You can stop the server in the terminal by pressing Ctrl+C and then Y and enter. Let's run the server again by running npm run dev. We will now go ahead and develop our Elevenlabs API route. In the API folder, under the Elevenlabs, double-click on the route file. The first thing I want to do is change this from a get to a post method instead. We will be passing the selected voice and the message text to this API route. So we can get those values by calling const message and voice, and we will get that by doing an await on request.json. This will basically take the request that's coming into the service and then extract our two variables from the request. And we will call those values message and voice. If I flip back to the Elevenlabs website for a second, I just want to show you how you can view the available APIs for Elevenlabs. After logging into your dashboard, you can click on Resources and then click on API. And from here, you can see all the available APIs and examples on how to call these APIs. So for text-to-speech, we will be using the first entry here, which is a post method. This post request takes in two important parameters. It will take in the voice ID which is basically the voice that we see in this drop-down list. And it also takes in your developer API key, which is what we stored in the environment variable file. Then for the body of the service, we will pass in the text, and optionally, we can specify the voice settings, like the stability and the similarity boost. These are the values that you see under the voice settings section over here. But for our demo, we will not be setting these, but you are more than welcome to play with it in your application. The response of this service, if it is successful, will be a blob containing the generated audio. We will take that information and store it as a file on our PC. So the first thing we need to do is call the Elevenlabs API. I'm going to write this in a try-catch block since the service could fail. And if we receive any errors, I will return a new response from the service where we stringify a new object with only one property, and that's error. For the value of error, I'll return error.message. I'm going to remove this response to our try block. Then in our try block, we will call the fetch method and we will pass in the API endpoint. And for the URL of the endpoint, we can actually get the API endpoint in the documentation by clicking on try it out. We can just use this defaulted voice ID. We can leave the API key blank on the screen and then click on execute. After clicking execute, we should get a sample curl object. And from here, we can see the API endpoint for this request. I'll just copy this. And just note that this value here represents the voice ID, which was defaulted over here. So back in our route, I'll paste in that URL, and we know that this value will be dynamic. So I'm going to convert this to a string literal instead, and then the voice ID will be a variable, so we can use the $ and curly braces, and this will set equal to voice, which will be the ID that was passed into the request of this API call. Then the fetch API takes in an object. We will specify the method as being post. And from the sample URL, we can see that we've got two header objects that we need to set. So I'll also provide the header object. First will be a property called accept with the value of audio/MPEG. We also need to specify the content type as application/JSON. Then we also have to provide our API key by adding a property called xi-api-key with a value of process.env. So this is fetching values from our environment variable file, and we called our variable Elevenlabs _API_key. Then for the body, we will call JSON.stringify. Within stringify, we'll pass in an object. We will pass our text by passing in the value message, and we'll also pass in the voice settings, which is an object with two values. So we will pass in stability as 0 and similarity boost of 0 as well. We are hard-coding these values, but if you wanted to, feel free to play with these values, or as a little side challenge, try and add these values to the user interface for the user to change. Fetch will return a promise, which we can await, and let's assign the result to a variable, which I'll call response. After the API call, we will add an if statement and say if response is not okay. So if the service call failed, we want to handle this. So if something goes wrong, we will throw a new error with the text something went wrong. So if this was all okay and we received a response, in other words, the response that we got back from Elevenlabs will actually contain the value of an audio file. We need to take the contents of that response and then write it to a file. This code can seem a bit confusing, but just bear with me, or feel free to copy it from my GitHub repo. So first I'll create a variable called array_buffer, and I'll set that equal to the response that we got back, and on that response there's a function called array_buffer. After getting the contents of the response, we will create a new variable called buffer and set that equal to buffer.from array_buffer. We now have the contents of the response in this variable buffer. Now we want to write this gibberish to an audio file on our server. So I'll just create a new variable called file, which will represent the file name for our audio file. This is really all up to you. I found a little hack to generate a unique file name using the math class. So I will call math.random. Then we will call toString 36, and then only grab the first few characters from this. for example, the first 7 characters. Now that we have the contents of the audio file in this buffer variable and we've set a file name, we now need to write the file to the file system. And in order to write files to the file system, we need to import the file system package. So at the top of the file, I will import fs from the file system package. I do want to import one more thing. I will import path from the path package. This will make it easy for us to specify the folder in which we want to write this file. So going back to our code, we can now call file system, and on file system there's a method called write file. So write file takes in 2 parameters. First is the location where the file should be written to, and the second is the content of the file. So in order to create this location of the file, we will call the path method .join, and I want to write this file to our public folder. Within public, we'll create a new folder called audio, and then for the file name, I'll use a string literal. I will pass in the file name that we created up here, .mp3, and then for the second parameter, which is the content of the file, we will pass in the buffer value, which we created up here. Then, for the callback function, which will run once the file has been written, we will pass in an anonymous function, and in this function, we'll simply console log a message that says file written successfully. So, after this has written the file to the file system, we want to return a successful response. So instead of hello next.js, I'll replace this with json.stringify. In stringify, we'll pass an object with the file property, and this will be the file name that was just generated. So we'll pass in $ curly braces with the variable file.mp3. Right, so just to recap, when we call this API, we'll pass in the message text as well as the voice ID. We then call the Elevenlabs API, passing in the voice ID as well as the message text. This will then return the contents of an audio file, and we then use the file system method, write file, to write those contents to a file in the public folder. So in public, I'm just going to create a folder called audio as well. So once we generate the audio, we should see the files being written to this audio folder. If this was successful, we will then return the file name to our application. So let's go back to our app. So let's go ahead and add the logic to our handle generate text-to-speech function. Let's remove these console logs and then add the logic to our own API call. I'll wrap this in a try-catch block. We'll simply write any errors to the console. Let's add some basic validation. So we'll say if text is null or text.trim equals space, then we'll show an alert like enter some text and we'll return. Then what this code will do, we'll call the fetch API. Specifically, we will call the API in our API route, which is called Elevenlabs. So it's this name over here. The fetch API also takes in an object. We will pass in the method as post for the headers. We will pass in the content type as application JSON. Then for the body, we will call json.stringify. For stringify, we'll pass in an object with 2 values, message, which is equal to text, and voice, which is equal to selected voice. So fetch returns a promise, which we need to await, and we'll assign the response to a variable called response. In order to use the await function, we need to convert this handle generate TSS function to an async function. After calling the fetch API, we will check that the response is okay. In fact, if the response is not okay, we will throw a new error with some text like something went wrong. If this was successful, we will grab the data by calling await response.json. So this data object, if we go back to the route for a second, this data object will give us a property called file, which contains the name of the file. So back in our page file, we can actually destructure file from this response value. We should be able to test this out now. But we've got a small issue. When calling this API, the selected voice needs to be the voice ID of the voice that we'd like to use. In this demo, we're simply setting the value as Bella, which is not valid. So I'm just going to hard code the value for now. We can get the sample ID by going to resources, to the API doc, and I'll just grab the example that they give in the documentation. So instead of passing selected voice, For the time being, I'll just pass in that voice ID. Let's give this a spin. We will type some text in our box and then click on Generate Text-to-Speech. Once this is done, we should see a new audio file showing up in the audio folder. Let's test this out. So I'll click on Generate Text-to-Speech. And after clicking on Text-to-Speech, we can see this message in the console that says file written successfully. So looking at the route file, that's coming from this console log over here. Also, under the public folder and under the audio folder, we can see this MP3 file over here. I'll click on that and then play it.
Hello, world.
I'm not sure if you heard that, but I'll play it again.
Hello, world.
So we now have an audio file with the voice saying, "Hello world." Great, so it seems that our API is working and we are writing the generated audio to our audio directory. The next thing we want to do is, after generating the audio file, we want a little audio element to display on this page, and we want the audio to play automatic. And this audio element will give us the ability to play the audio again or download the audio file. Let's work on that next. This audio element should only show once an audio file is available. So we'll need to use state to keep track of that. So back in our page file, from React, we will also import use state. Then in the home function, I'll create a new state, which will store the name of the audio file that was generated. And only when this value is set should we display the audio controls. So to create state, you specify a new variable and then these square brackets. We will give our state variable a name. I'll just call it audio. And we then need to create a setter function for setting the value of audio. I will call the setter function setAudio. We'll set that equal to use state. And initially the value will be null. Because it takes some amount of time for this fetch API to return a value, so as we're waiting for the Elevenlabs API to come back with the audio data, and the time that it takes for the file system to write the file, we are sort of waiting in limbo. So I'm also going to create a loading state by calling const loading set loading, and I'll set that equal to use state with an initial value of false. So what we can do now is, above the try block, we can set the loading state to true. Once all of this processing is complete, we want to set the loading state back to false. So below the catch block, we'll add a new block called finally. And in finally, we will call the set loading function and we'll set the loading state to false. The finally block will execute whether or not our try logic was successful or not. So if we do get a response back, we will now set our audio state to the file name. So now what I'll do is, on the button, we will add a property called disabled. And if the loading state is true, the button will be disabled and the user will not be able to click the button again while processing is busy. If it's false, the button will be clickable. We can also make it a bit more user-friendly by adding a condition around this text, where we say that if the loading state is true, then we'll write the text generating please wait. Else, we will write the text generate text-to-speech. Let's try that again. So I'll type the text hello world and I'll click on generate text-to-speech. So for a brief moment there, we would have seen the loading state of the button and we can see a new file in our audio directory. So our loading state is working. Let's add the audio element to our page. So below the button, I'll add a new JavaScript condition, which says that if the audio element is not initial, then we will create the audio HTML element, which is a self-closing element. The source of this element, I'll add a string literal, which says we can find this element under the audio folder / and then the value of the audio state, which will be the MP3 file name. Note that we do not have to specify the public folder here, as all static assets are assumed to sit in the public folder. Let's save this. Let's generate another file. Then let's also add a property called controls and save. So after saving controls, we can now see all of these controls popping up in the element, including the play button.
Hello, world.
So clicking this plays our audio file.
Hello, world.
There's one more property that I'd like to add, and that's called autoplay. So once this audio element renders to the screen, I want it to automatically start playing the audio. Let's save this and refresh the app. Let's generate some new audio. I'll just give it some text like hello there, and let's click on generate. After clicking on this button and after the file was generated, the audio should start playing by itself.
Hello there.
Awesome. Finally, let's remove the hard coding for the voice ID and let's fetch a list of available voices from the Elevenlabs API. So what we need to do is when this page is loaded for the first time, we want to call the fetch API on Elevenlabs to fetch the available voices and then render out those voices in this select dropdown. If I switch back over to the Elevenlabs API page for a second, you can see that under the voices section, there's this get request over here called voices. The description says get voices. And one thing that's interesting about this specific endpoint is although it states to pass in the developer key in the header, it's actually not necessary. So because we don't need access to the API key, which should only be available on the server side, we can actually just call this API from our front end without specifying this API key. Let me show you how. So when this page loads for the first time, we want to call a lifecycle hook called useEffect, which will run once when the page loads, and it will fetch the available list of voices from Elevenlabs. So from React, we will call useEffect, and then just above the return statement, we will call the useEffect function, which takes in a function module as input, as well as an array of dependencies. If we leave this array initial, this useEffect hook will only run once when the page loads, which is what we want. In this function, we will call the API on Elevenlabs to get back the list of voices. Because the fetch API returns a promise, we need to await the result. So we have two options here. Either we can call the fetch API and chain the then function on top of that, or we can await the result like this. The only problem is that in order to call the await function, this calling function needs to be async, and we should not convert the useEffect function to async. So what I'll do instead is I'll create a new async function called getVoices, and I will move my logic into this function. So for fetch, we will call the following URL: https api.elevenlabs.io/v1/voices. Because this is a GET request, we do not need to specify any other attributes. I will assign the result of this fetch to a variable called response. If response is not okay, we'll throw a new error. Else, we'll create a variable called data and await response.json. So in this data variable, we will now be able to fetch the list of voices in a property called voices. I want to store this array of voices in another state variable. So below these states, I'll create a new const called voices with a setter function of set voices. We'll set this equal to useState, and the default value will just be a blank array. So back in our code, we will call set voices, and we'll make that equal to data.voices. Also, because this API could fail for a number of reasons, I do want to wrap this in a try-catch block. So I'll move all of this logic into my try block, and in the catch, we'll simply write the message to the console. We can now call the getVoices function in our useEffect. So this means that when the page loads for the first time, the useEffect hook will run, which will call the getVoices function. GetVoices will go to the Elevenlabs API to get the list of available voices. If we get the results back, we set our new state variable voices to the array that we got back from Elevenlabs. We can now dynamically render out the list of available voices in this select element. So let's go back to our select element. We can remove this option here, and instead we'll add curly braces and we'll map through our voices array, which will give us the specific voice that we're on. And for each voice, we'll return an option tag. The text for the option will be voice.name, and on the option element itself, we will specify a property called value, and this will be equal to voice.voiceID. We also need to specify a key property because we are mapping through an array in React. And the value of this key property will be voice.voiceID. So after doing this, let's just fix up one typo. Back in our useEffect, this response should be response like that. And after saving this, we can see a change in our application, and we can actually see the different voices pulling through now. And if we look at our HTML elements, we can see all the names pulling through, and the value of these options are the voice IDs. Great. So what we can do now is we can go back to our handle generate TTS function, and selected voice will now give us the correct voice ID. So instead of passing a hard-coded value, let's replace that with selected voice. So let's try this. I'll add some text like hello world. We'll select Rachel and let's click on generate text-to-speech.
Hello world.
Let's change this to the next name, Tommy.
Hello world.
And clearly we're getting a different voice. Let's change it to Josh.
Hello world.
Excellent stuff. You are now able to integrate text-to-speech into any of your applications. I hope this video was informative. If you like this type of content and content on AI in general, please consider subscribing to my channel and please like this video. It really helps the channel grow. And thank you very much for all the support. The channel just hit 1,000 subscribers and we're getting close to 2,000 subscribers. I'm extremely grateful for all the support that you guys have shown and for all the positive comments that I've received. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Bye bye.